The desert highway incident. My family has this old, beaten-up 2012 Subaru Outback that's honestly on its last legs. I don't know how, but this car refuses to quit. It's been through the ringer, engine issues, worn-out brakes that feel like they're made of mush, and half of the electronics are either flickering or completely dead. It's a miracle it still runs. My parents are basically waiting for it to die so they can finally get a new one, but, of course, I'm the one who gets stuck with driving it. In addition to all the mechanical issues, the windshield wipers don't work at all, so driving in the rain is like playing Russian roulette. Even a drizzle is enough to completely blur my view. Everyone knows Arizona is the desert state, though, so rain is hardly a concern around here. I remember my elementary school teacher used to make a big deal about how rarely it rained here. Anyway, this all happened a few summers ago when I was on my way back from visiting my friend Jason in New Mexico. We'd been friends since childhood, but life had gotten in the way, and it had been years since I'd seen him. I love road trips, so I figured I'd make an adventure out of the drive. I hit the road alone, crossing through miles of empty desert. The drive there was great. I stayed at Jason's place for a few nights, and we did a lot of catching up. It was the kind of trip you need every once in a while. The drive back was mostly uneventful. The miles ticked by with ease, and I was looking forward to getting home. But as soon as I crossed into Arizona, a storm hit. Not just a drizzle, but a full-blown thunderstorm, complete with lightning and torrential rain. I later found out it was one of the heaviest rainfalls they'd had in years. I've driven through rain before, but nothing like this. It didn't help that my windshield wipers were essentially useless. I couldn't see a thing, and I knew I had no choice but to pull over. I found a spot off the highway and parked as far into the desert as I could, just far enough that a passing truck wouldn't miss me in the rain. I thought about calling the police, but the idea of paying for a tow or even a fine didn't sound too appealing, especially with money being tight. Plus, I didn't want to bother my parents to drive 3.5 hours to rescue me. So, I was stuck there alone. The rain pounded against the car, and I figured I'd just wait it out. I thought I'd pass the time maybe by taking a nap. But, sitting there for an hour in the storm, the isolation started messing with my mind. The longer I sat there, the more uneasy I felt. There was this strange, unexplainable urge to leave, to get out of the car and drive away, but I knew it wasn't safe. The storm raged on, and the sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting the desert in a strange twilight. I hadn't planned on being out here so long, and the thought of spending the night alone in the car in the middle of nowhere started to gnaw at me. The fact that I couldn't see a thing outside didn't help. I don't scare easily, but being alone in the desert, with the wind howling and the rain pouring, it wasn't exactly calming. Suddenly, the rain started to die down. It was a welcome relief. The sun was already gone, and with it, the world around me was plunged into complete darkness. But just as I started to think about getting back on the road, I noticed something strange. At first, I thought it was lightning, but it wasn't. It was bright, sharp bursts of light cutting through the darkness. They flashed quickly, jumping from place to place. I watched them for a while, and then realized they were coming closer. My heart started to race, and for a moment, I wasn't sure what to do. I don't know why, but something in me told me to leave the car. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my phone, but I didn't want to call 911 just yet. Something inside told me it wasn't time. Instead, I decided to hide. I scrambled out of the car and ran for the nearest rock formation. The rain was still coming down in sheets, but I didn't care. I could feel my breath coming in short, shallow gasps, and my palms were sweating. I crouched behind the rocks, praying the rain would mask the sound of my breathing. Slowly, I peered around the corner. The lights were definitely getting closer, and soon I could make out the shapes of people. They were carrying flashlights. 3 figures, each moving in odd, erratic patterns, the flashlights swinging wildly as though they were stumbling. The way they moved was off. It was like they were on something. The figures circled my car, and I could see the beams of their flashlights sweeping across the vehicle. They weren't just passing by, they were inspecting it. I couldn't figure out what they were looking for. My heart was pounding, and the air felt thick with tension. Suddenly, one of the figures fired a gunshot into the air. The sound rattled me to my core, and I bit down hard on my lip, almost breaking the skin. I froze, terrified. I could hear my own heartbeat, pounding in my ears, and I didn't dare move. I stayed hidden, waiting, hoping they wouldn't notice me. For what felt like hours, I sat there, eyes wide and glued to the scene unfolding in front of me. When I finally dared to peek out again, the flashlights were gone. The figures had disappeared into the dark, leaving only the echo of the storm. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to stay hidden, but the other part of me knew I needed help. I pulled out my phone, my hands trembling, and called 911. My voice was barely a whisper as I tried to explain what I had seen. The operator told me they were sending someone, but I wasn't sure if I could believe them. It felt like an eternity before I finally saw the flashing blue and red lights in the distance. The figures, the strange men in the desert, bolted as soon as they saw the police lights. When the officer pulled up beside my car, I could barely breathe, but I was too relieved to feel scared anymore. The officer listened to my story, though he didn't seem too shocked. His lack of surprise made everything feel worse. He stayed with me until the rain let up, and didn't even mention towing my car, which I was grateful for. But even now, every time I drive through the desert or hear about something strange, I think about that night. I haven't done a road trip since. It's been a while, but I can still remember those flashes of light and the way the men moved like they weren't quite real. The night lingered in my mind like an unsettling shadow. Even though the rain had stopped, the anxiety remained, clinging to me as if the figures were still out there, watching, waiting for me to slip up. The officer left shortly after the storm had cleared, but I stayed in my car, hands gripping the steering wheel, unsure of what to do next. The flashing lights of the police car had driven the figures away, but that only made me more paranoid. Had they been looking for something? Had they been waiting for the storm to subside, to make their move? I couldn't shake the feeling that they were after more than just a random target. But what? And why me? The officer had promised to patrol the area and keep an eye on things, but as I looked into the dark abyss of the desert, it felt like the storm hadn't completely passed. It was as though it had left something behind, something that I couldn't see but could feel. I took a deep breath and pulled myself together. The rain had stopped, the storm was gone, and I had to get back on the road. The longer I stayed here, the more I felt like I was inviting trouble. I turned the key, the engine sputtering to life, and began driving again, slowly at first, hesitant. The desert stretched out endlessly in front of me. It was an eerie kind of emptiness, as though I was the only person in the world. The occasional flash of lightning still flickered in the distance, but it no longer felt like a natural phenomenon. It felt wrong, as if it was trying to guide me into something, an unspoken warning. The road ahead was empty, and I felt the weight of my isolation pressing down on me. It was as if the storm had created a kind of vacuum, a quiet that was unsettling in its intensity. I kept my eyes on the road, but my mind kept returning to what I had seen, the flashlights moving in wild patterns, the figures searching for something, and the gunshot that had pierced the night. The more I thought about it, the more certain I became that they weren't just some random drifters. Then, the radio came on. It was static at first, a low hum filling the car, but then a voice broke through, distorted and faint. If you're out there, you need to stay away from the desert. They know you're here. They know you saw them. I slammed my hand against the dashboard, turning the radio off in an instant. I hadn't touched it. It hadn't been on before. I stared ahead, my mind racing. My hands were sweating again, my heart pounding in my chest. The radio had come on by itself. There was no way it could have been a coincidence. And the voice, it was so clear, so intentional. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was trying to reach me. But who? And why? I gripped the wheel tighter, my eyes darting around. The road ahead seemed to stretch on forever, the barren desert swallowing everything in its path. The thought of going home seemed too distant, too unreachable. The desert had a way of making everything feel far away. I passed mile after mile of sand and rocks, my mind racing. The flickering lights in the distance began again, just like before. At first, they were faint, but as I drove, they grew stronger, getting closer. Not just one or two lights, but several, spread out across the desert like the eyes of something watching me. I hit the brakes and pulled over again, my heart in my throat. Was this real? Or had I lost my mind after hours of driving alone in the desert? I couldn't decide whether to stay in the car or get out and confront whatever was happening. It didn't make sense, but nothing about this situation had made sense since I first pulled over. The lights were still flickering, and then the voices began, too. Faint whispers, almost imperceptible at first, but gradually growing louder. They were calling my name. I could hear them, clear as day, coming from all directions. Come out. We know you're there. My body froze in place. The car felt like a cage now, a trap. The voices, no, they weren't real. This had to be a hallucination. I tried to steady myself, to remind myself that it was just the storm messing with my mind. But the urge to get out, to follow the lights, became overwhelming. There was something magnetic about them, pulling me out of the car, guiding me toward whatever was lurking out there. I reached for the door handle, but just as I was about to step out, a loud bang startled me. My heart skipped a beat, and I snapped my head to the side. It was the sound of a gunshot. I froze. The voice on the radio echoed in my head. They know you're here. I knew I had to leave. But the lights, those lights, were too close now. They were moving again, closer than before, surrounding my car in a way that felt deliberate, predatory. My mind screamed at me to run, to drive away, but I couldn't. I had to wait. Wait for the lights to fade, or for whatever was out there to reveal itself. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with the weight of something dark and unseen. Suddenly, a flash of white light blinded me, so bright it almost felt like it was coming from within the car itself. And just as quickly, it was gone. But the lights outside, the lights that had been moving closer, were now gone, too. Everything was silent. The radio crackled again, and this time, the voice was clear, almost a whisper, as if it was right behind me. You should have never left the city. I didn't wait to hear more. My foot slammed on the accelerator, and I sped away from the desert, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't look back. I couldn't. As I drove, the world around me seemed to shrink, like the desert was trying to close in on me. And for the first time, I realized I wasn't just afraid of what I had seen, I was afraid of what I couldn't see. What had followed me from the desert, and what it might want from me next. The night stretched on, and I kept driving, not knowing when, or if, this nightmare would ever end. The miles passed in a blur. The road stretched ahead of me, an endless ribbon of asphalt disappearing into the night. The rain had stopped, but the chill of the desert air clung to me, a constant reminder that something was still out there, following me, watching me from just beyond the reach of my headlights. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. My mind kept replaying everything, the lights in the desert, the voices on the radio, the eerie stillness after the gunshot. It all felt like it was somehow connected. The more I thought about it, the more it seemed like a puzzle, one that I couldn't quite piece together. I glanced in my rearview mirror. Nothing. Just the empty desert stretching out behind me, swallowed by the darkness. But I couldn't stop looking. The nagging feeling that something was still out there refused to let go. The lights hadn't been a hallucination. I had seen them. I had heard the voices. And now, there was only silence. I pushed the accelerator down, faster now, as if speed could outrun the fear clawing at me. I didn't know what I was running from, but I felt the need to get away from that place as fast as possible. The thought of the desert, with its vast emptiness, was enough to send a shiver through my spine. What had been out there? What had those people, if they were even people, wanted? I thought about stopping, pulling into the next town, finding somewhere safe to rest. But the idea of stopping, of letting my guard down even for a moment, felt dangerous. What if they were already waiting for me, somewhere, just out of sight, watching me as I slept? No, I couldn't stop. I couldn't risk it. I drove on, hours passing, my mind lost in the fog of exhaustion. My body was tired, but my mind was racing. What had I seen? Who were those people? What had they been looking for? And why had they let me go? As I neared the outskirts of the next town, I felt a strange sense of relief. The lights from the town were like a beacon, a sign that I was almost back to safety. The world outside felt more normal here. Less menacing. I wasn't sure if I could ever shake the fear that had settled in my chest, but at least for now, I had made it. I turned onto the highway, heading toward home. The road was empty, and the only sound in the car was the hum of the engine and the soft rhythm of the tires on the asphalt. The desert was behind me, and for the first time in hours, I allowed myself to breathe a little easier. But as I rounded a bend in the road, I saw something. Just a flicker of movement in the distance, barely visible through the night. I slammed on the brakes, my heart leaping into my throat. I leaned forward, squinting into the darkness. A figure. It was standing by the side of the road, just outside the reach of the headlights. It didn't move. Just stood there, perfectly still. My breath caught in my chest. I didn't want to stop. I didn't want to know what it was, who it was. But something deep inside, made me slow down, made me come to a stop just a few feet away from the figure. The headlights illuminated the figure, and for a split second, I thought I recognized it. It was tall, cloaked in shadows, with no discernible features. But the sense of familiarity hit me like a punch to the gut. I had seen this figure before. I reached for my phone, ready to call for help, but before I could dial, the figure moved. Slowly. It began to walk toward the car, each step deliberate, each movement sending a chill down my spine. I slammed my foot on the accelerator, tearing away from the figure as fast as I could. The car roared to life, the engine screaming in protest as I pushed it harder than I had before. I didn't dare look back. The town disappeared in my rearview mirror, and the dark desert stretched on, once again, like a vast sea of emptiness. The figure was gone. I was alone again. I didn't stop driving until I reached the safety of my home, the familiar streets and lights welcoming me like a warm embrace. I didn't share my story with anyone. Who would believe it? The voice on the radio, the lights, The figures in the desert, it was too strange, too surreal. No one would understand. But even as I lay in bed that night, the silence of my room felt different. The fear, the unease, lingered. I had escaped the desert, but the desert had left something with me. And I knew, deep down, that it wasn't over. I had seen them, and I would never forget. Something had changed. The story ends here, but the question remains, what was out there in the desert? Were they real? Or was it all just a product of fear and isolation? And more importantly, who were they really watching? Story 2. My name is Emily, and what I'm about to tell you is by far the strangest experience I've ever gone through. My best friend, Rachel, and I were driving from Texas to New York a few months ago. We had been visiting some friends who were going to school in Austin, and we'd been having an amazing time. But eventually, we had to head back home and get back to our everyday lives. We decided to make the drive a little more fun, turning it into a road trip, just the two of us with snacks, music, and the opportunity to catch up on everything we hadn't talked about in ages. In hindsight, it probably would have been smarter to stay one more night at our friend's place, but I was eager to get home. So, we planned to drive the entire stretch in one go, straight through the night. We drove for hours, and by the time the sun came up, I could feel my back aching from sitting still for so long. I turned to Rachel and suggested that we stop for a break. A little gas, a snack, and maybe something to eat would help, I thought. We passed a couple of exits before deciding to get off in a place that, according to the signs, was a charming little town. I don't remember the name of the town, it wasn't anything memorable, but it was supposed to be a lively, touristy spot. From the moment we drove in, though, something didn't sit right. The streets were eerily empty, and the buildings looked run down, as though they hadn't been taken care of for years. It didn't make sense. It was supposed to be a tourist destination, yet there was a strange, almost abandoned feeling to the place. It wasn't your typical ghost town, but it had a haunting quality to it. I don't know how to explain it, but we both sensed something was wrong. We decided to stop at a convenience store, the first place we came across. It wasn't long before we reached the heart of the town, though heart is probably too strong a word for it. It felt more like a forgotten corner of the world, where time stood still and nothing ever changed. Inside the store, things seemed normal at first. Rachel was looking for a specific drink, but quickly got frustrated when she couldn't find it. She's a bit of a drama queen, so I indulged her, agreeing that we should try a different store. I was still set on getting my Gatorade, so I walked up to the counter to pay. The cashier was a woman in her 30s or 40s, with dark brown hair. She was on the taller side, and again, everything about her seemed perfectly normal, except for one thing. She was wearing suspenders. That stood out to me because I hadn't seen anyone wear suspenders in a while. I paid and left the store, but as we crossed the street to the next convenience store, something happened that would change everything. When we walked inside, I froze. The cashier behind the counter looked exactly like the woman from the first store. Same hair, same height, same face, it was uncanny. I couldn't help myself. I stared at her for a little too long, and I could tell I was making her uncomfortable. I eventually asked her if she had a twin or a sister. She gave me a strange, skeptical look before answering that she was an only child. She told me it was a weird question and that I shouldn't ask strangers that. I tried to explain myself, but she didn't respond, and the tension was palpable. Feeling awkward, I dragged Rachel out of the store, but I couldn't shake the feeling of déjà vu. Did you notice anything weird about that girl? I asked Rachel. She shrugged, not remembering what the other cashier had looked like, and suggested that I was probably just tired from driving. But I knew what I had seen, and I couldn't let it go. I was determined to prove it. We ran back to the first store, but when we got there, the cashier was completely different. The woman who had been behind the counter was now shorter, with light hair, and looked like she was in her 50s. There was no possible way anyone could have confused her with the woman from the second store. It was as if I had imagined the whole thing. Rachel told me to forget about it, that I was probably just seeing things because of exhaustion. But I knew I wasn't imagining things. The whole situation was strange and unsettling, but I had no choice but to let it go. We were both starting to feel more on edge, and I was eager to leave the town and get back on the road. We stopped at a gas station to refuel, and again, the weirdness escalated. The station was empty, just our car, the pumps, and a small building in the back. We were the only car in the lot. Inside, Rachel took her sweet time looking for the drink she wanted, but once again, it wasn't there. I paid, and we left the store, but when we stepped outside, everything had changed. What had been a completely empty gas station was now packed to the brim with cars. Every pump was filled, and people were standing around, talking. It was as if the station had suddenly transformed into the busiest place in town, and all the people seemed to be staring at us. I felt a wave of discomfort wash over me, but Rachel and I didn't say anything. The atmosphere was too strange, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. By now, we both agreed that something bizarre was happening. We decided to forget about food and head back to the highway. My gut told me it was time to leave, and I just wanted to get away from this weird place as fast as I could. The drive back onto the highway should have been a relief, but that feeling, the feeling that something was off, lingered. We didn't talk much for a while. Both of us were lost in our own thoughts, processing what had happened. Then, as we were driving, a car passed us. It was a Toyota Sienna, an old minivan with a cracked windshield. The crack formed a spiderweb pattern across the glass, and it was hard to miss. Rachel made a joke about the car, but it wasn't long before something even stranger happened. About 10 minutes later, the exact same minivan passed us again. Same make, same model, and exactly the same crack in the windshield. There was no way this could have happened. We had been driving in a straight line, and there was no way that minivan could have gotten ahead of us. Rachel started panicking, saying, "Oh my God," over and over again. I could feel my own heart racing as I tried to keep calm for her sake, but I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that was settling in my chest. We tried speeding up, but no matter what we did, the minivan kept appearing. The odds of passing two identical minivans with the same windshield crack were next to impossible. To make things worse, when I glanced at the GPS, I realized that an hour had passed since we had left the gas station. How was that even possible? We hadn't taken any detours. We had been driving straight the entire time. The GPS was showing we were much further along the route than we should have been. Rachel was beside herself, and I was too scared to say anything. I didn't know what to tell her. The whole situation was starting to feel like some nightmare, and I had no explanation for any of it. We kept driving, both of us silently freaking out. Finally, we made it back to the highway, and the nightmare seemed to end there. But as I think back to that day, it still feels like we woke up from some strange, disjointed dream. I can't explain what happened, and I've stopped trying to find an explanation. I've looked online, and I've found other stories similar to mine, strange occurrences in odd towns where nothing makes sense. But even then, I can't seem to shake that feeling in my gut. The one that told me something was wrong. Something was watching us, and it wasn't finished. The days after that strange incident were a blur, and I tried to go on with my life. I didn't talk much about it to anyone, because every time I did, I could see the skeptical look in their eyes. I knew what they were thinking. It's just exhaustion, just a weird coincidence. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I could feel it in every bone of my body that something wasn't right. The feeling lingered, heavy and unsettling, gnawing at me, even though I was home and safe. Rachel and I barely spoke about it after we finally made it back to New York. We didn't even acknowledge the weirdness between us, though I could tell she was just as uneasy about what happened as I was. It was as if we both made an unspoken pact not to bring it up again. But we both knew the truth. Weeks passed. The routine of work and everyday life took over. I tried to forget about it. I really did. But every time I saw a gas station or a convenience store, I would remember that strange town, the unsettling feeling in my gut, and the eerie moments we spent in the middle of nowhere. It was hard to ignore the sense that something had followed us back. One evening, I was at home scrolling through my phone when I stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. It was a forum, a place where people shared strange experiences, particularly related to bizarre occurrences on the road. I had never really paid much attention to these types of things before, but the title of the post caught my eye. Have you ever driven through a town that doesn't exist? I clicked on it without thinking, but as soon as I started reading, I felt the same chill that I had that day in the desert town. The poster described something almost identical to what Rachel and I had gone through. They had driven through a ghost town, a place that felt off, like it shouldn't exist. The same weird experiences, the same sense of unease, and the same strange time discrepancies. The user claimed to have seen a minivan with a cracked windshield, just like the one we had seen. They had even mentioned the sudden appearance of people at a gas station, just like what had happened to us. I didn't know what to think. Was this some kind of urban legend? Were people experiencing the same thing, or was it all just coincidence? But it didn't feel like coincidence. It felt too real, too specific. The details matched exactly, and I couldn't ignore the feeling of being pulled into something bigger. I scrolled down through the forum, reading more posts, until I found something that sent a shiver down my spine. If you ever find yourself in a place like this, don't stay. Leave immediately. There's something in those towns, something that doesn't want you to leave. You'll lose time, and you'll lose yourself. There's no way out once you've been touched by it. I felt my throat tighten. It was exactly what I had felt. Like something was watching me, pulling me in, making sure I never really escaped. The feeling in my gut that had never quite gone away. I clicked away from the post, my head spinning, and closed my phone. I didn't tell Rachel about what I had found. I knew she wouldn't want to hear it. Besides, I didn't want to frighten her any more than I already had. But the weight of it all grew heavier. The town, the strange people, the time distortion, it all seemed connected, and the more I thought about it, the more I felt like we had crossed some invisible line that we weren't supposed to. Weeks turned into months, and life continued. But every time I drove, every time I passed a convenience store or a gas station, I couldn't help but wonder, what if I was wrong? What if there was more to the story than I'd ever realized? And then, one afternoon, I was out driving by myself, just a routine trip to the grocery store. As I passed a gas station on the outskirts of town, I saw it. That same minivan. The same cracked windshield. The same scratches down the side. It was parked at the pump, and a man stood next to it, pumping gas. My heart skipped a beat. I had to stop. I couldn't ignore it this time. I pulled into the station, trying to remain calm, my hands gripping the steering wheel as I parked. My breath quickened as I glanced at the man by the minivan. He looked normal. Just an average guy, in his 40s, wearing a flannel shirt. But the moment I saw him, the memories of that strange town rushed back, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I forced myself to get out of the car. I had to know if it was the same minivan. I had to know if this was some bizarre coincidence or if something was really going on. As I walked toward the gas pumps, I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched, like someone, or something, was waiting for me to make my move. I reached the minivan and stared at the cracked windshield. It was exactly the same. I felt dizzy. This couldn't be happening. There was no way this was just a coincidence. I turned to look at the man, but he was gone. The station was empty now. No cars, no people, just silence. My mind raced, and for a moment, I felt like I was in a dream. Was I going crazy? Was this some kind of deja vu playing tricks on me? I walked back to my car, my hands trembling. I got in and drove off, my mind racing, but my body feeling as if it were an autopilot. The further I drove, the more I began to doubt myself. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I was overthinking it. Maybe the world wasn't as strange as I thought. But I knew something wasn't right. As I drove, I glanced at the GPS. And for a brief moment, I thought I saw the same coordinates, the same location as the town we'd passed through months ago. I quickly tapped the screen to refresh it, but when the map came back up, it was gone. It felt like the whole world had just shifted again, and I was caught in the middle of something I couldn't understand. I didn't stop driving. And I haven't stopped driving since. But I know one thing for sure, wherever that town is, and whatever happened to us, it's still out there. And it's watching. Waiting. The drive back home was long and silent. The weight of what I had just experienced hung heavily in the air, pressing down on me like a storm cloud. Every mile that passed, every familiar turn in the road, felt like I was inching closer to something I didn't want to face. I could feel the unsettling pull, the sensation that something was still chasing me, just out of sight. It was like being stuck in a bad dream, knowing you can't wake up no matter how hard you try. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the sky was beginning to darken. The quiet hum of the engine was the only sound that accompanied me as I shut the car off and sat in silence for a few moments. My hands were still shaking, but I tried to calm myself down. It had to be over. I had made it home. I was safe. But the truth was, I didn't feel safe. Not anymore. That night, I couldn't sleep. The feeling that something was lurking, just beyond the reach of my senses, kept me awake. I kept replaying everything in my mind, the town, the strange people, the minivan that kept appearing, and the eerie time distortions. It all felt like a puzzle that I couldn't solve, no matter how many times I tried to piece it together. And every time I thought I had a handle on it, another strange thing would happen. I started having dreams, vivid, unsettling dreams, of that town. The streets, empty but full of eyes that followed me. The gas stations, crowded with people who stared at me as if they knew something I didn't. I saw the minivan, too, always in the same spot, its cracked windshield glinting in the light like an omen. And then, in the middle of one of those dreams, I heard a voice. It was faint at first, barely more than a whisper, but it grew louder, more insistent. You're still here. You're still in the loop. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding. The room was dark, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. I felt as if I had been trapped in that dream for far too long. As if the town, the people, the strange occurrences were still with me. I jumped out of bed and grabbed my phone, trying to steady my trembling hands. I didn't want to go back to that town. I didn't want to know more. But the curiosity was eating at me. The more I tried to push it away, the stronger it became. I opened up the same forum I had found weeks ago, hoping to find answers. Maybe someone else had the same experience. Maybe they had figured it out. I needed something, anything, to explain the unexplainable. I scrolled through the posts, each one more disturbing than the last. People describing strange towns, disappearing cars, time slipping in and out of place. And then I found it, a post from someone who claimed to have lived in the exact same town Rachel and I had passed through. The user's story was chilling, but there was one line that stuck with me more than anything else. Once you pass through, you're part of the town. You can leave, but it never really lets you go. I felt my blood run cold. My head was spinning. Could it be true? Had we really crossed into some place where reality didn't work the way it should? A place that didn't want us to leave? I tried to shake off the thought, but it kept coming back, gnawing at me. I couldn't ignore it any longer. The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The dream, the forum post, the strange sense of deja vu I had every time I thought about that town. I knew I had to go back. I didn't tell Rachel. I wasn't sure if she would understand, and I wasn't sure I could explain it all without sounding completely insane. But something in me was pulling me toward it. I had to know if the town was real, if I had really experienced everything I thought I had. I packed a bag and hit the road again, this time alone. The drive felt different, heavier, like I was driving into something I wasn't ready for. As I crossed into the state where the town was supposed to be, a sense of dread settled over me. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see something following me, just out of sight. And then, I saw it. The town. It was just as I remembered it. The streets were empty, the buildings run down and weathered. The air was thick with silence, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I drove through, past the same gas stations, the same convenience stores, all of it. But this time, it felt different. The town seemed to know I was there, as if it was waiting for me. I pulled over at a familiar convenience store. The same one where we had first stopped all those months ago. I stepped out of the car, my heart racing. The store was empty, but I could feel something, someone, watching me. I stepped inside and walked up to the counter, but no one was there. It was like the store was frozen in time. Suddenly, the door opened behind me, and I spun around. The woman who had been the cashier before was standing there. But this time, she didn't look quite the same. Her eyes were hollow, her face expressionless. "You shouldn't have come back," she said in a low, eerie voice. I tried to speak, but no words came. I turned to run, but the door slammed shut in front of me. The walls of the store seemed to close in, and the lights flickered. I was trapped. "You can't leave once you've been marked," the woman said, her voice now coming from every direction. "You'll never leave. You'll always be part of this town." I gasped for air, my heart pounding in my chest. My mind was spinning, and I couldn't make sense of what was happening. But I knew, deep down, that it wasn't just a nightmare anymore. This town wasn't going to let me go. I bolted for the door, and this time, it opened. I ran back to my car, but as I drove away, the town seemed to stretch on forever in my rearview mirror. The same cracked minivan appeared on the side of the road again, watching me leave, waiting for me to come back. And I knew then, without a doubt, that I couldn't escape. Not truly. The town had marked me. And now, it would never let me go. Story 3. The Girl Who Vanished. My name is Ben, and what happened to me a few years ago is something I'll never be able to explain. Back when I was in my early 20s, I lived about 30 minutes outside of Portland, Maine. I had just gone through a difficult breakup with my girlfriend of 2 years. It was a strange time in my life, one of those periods where you feel a little lost, trying to figure things out, searching for meaning without really realizing it. My grandmother was very religious, attending church every Sunday without fail. After my grandfather passed away, I started going with her to church, partly to support her and partly because I felt like I needed some grounding too. My grandfather had been a respected veteran and a pillar of the community, and when he died, it left a huge hole in my grandmother's life. Despite her grief, her faith remained unshaken. She often told me she knew he had finally been reunited with the Lord, and the peace that gave her was something I deeply admired. One Sunday after the service, I met her. This girl. I still feel like it was all some kind of fever dream. I had never seen her around before, which was unusual since our town was small, and everyone knew each other, especially at church. She was striking, dark, curly hair and deep hazel eyes. I waited until the service ended and approached her. At first, I wasn't sure what I was drawn to. Maybe it was her beauty, but there was something else, something that made me curious. We started talking, and I instantly felt this connection, like we had known each other for a long time, even though we had just met. Her name was Kaylee, and she had this quiet, mysterious charm that made me want to learn more about her. I kept asking her about her life, family, where she was from, but she kept teasing me, cracking jokes and saying I'd have to take her out to dinner if I wanted those answers. I actually enjoyed the banter. It felt easy and natural, and she had this playful, almost enigmatic side to her that I found myself drawn to. After a bit more teasing, she told me that her family had just moved to the area, and she went to college in a town nearby. I couldn't help but be relieved. I hadn't missed someone new in our community all this time. By the time we finished talking, I had her number, and I was feeling like I had just stumbled upon something interesting. The next week, we texted frequently, exchanged social media, and kept the conversation flowing. I remember scrolling through her Instagram one night, surprised to see how few followers she had. It felt refreshing, no social media fame, just someone living her life, trying to figure things out like me. We talked about all kinds of things, and eventually, she opened up a little more about her family situation. It wasn't great. Her stepfather was an abusive alcoholic, and she had been through some rough times with him. Worse than that, her biological father had done even worse things, though she wouldn't go into details. They had moved here to escape him, leaving behind everything she had known. I didn't want to pry, but I was just glad she was opening up to me. It felt good to connect with someone on that deeper level, and while I loved the mystery of her, I appreciated the honesty as well. I didn't ask her out right away because I figured I'd see her at church again. The next Sunday, there she was. It felt like a sign, so after the service, I asked her if she wanted to grab dinner. She smiled and agreed without hesitation. We made plans to meet up later that week. The night of our date came, and I couldn't help but be nervous. I kept telling myself it was just dinner and a movie, nothing too fancy, but I wanted to make it special. It went well. She was a great listener, and it was easy to talk to her. I felt like I could be myself, and she seemed genuinely interested in what I had to say. Afterward, we grabbed a quick bite to eat, and when the night was still young, I suggested a drive. It was the perfect way to keep talking without the distractions of a restaurant. We drove out of town on a winding, two-lane road that was technically a highway but had a more peaceful, isolated vibe to it. The trees lined the road, the night sky stretched endlessly above us. It felt perfect. That's when everything changed. Without warning, Kaylee started speaking, but it wasn't in English. Her words came fast and jumbled, almost like French, or something close to it. At first, I thought she was joking, maybe playing some kind of prank on me, but then I noticed her eyes. They rolled back completely, leaving only the whites showing. I swerved the car, almost crashing into the barrier. My heart started pounding. She looked like she was having a seizure, or worse, like she was in some kind of trance. I pulled over to the shoulder of the road, trying to stay calm, but I could feel panic setting in. I fumbled for my phone and called 911, not knowing exactly what to say other than that I thought she was having a seizure. I looked at her, trying to make sure she was still breathing, but she just kept muttering in that strange language, her head shaking violently. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to touch her, but I felt like I had to do something. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Kaylee snapped her head forward, her eyes going back to normal, and she just stared at me with this wild, wide-eyed look that I will never forget. Before I could even say a word, she threw open the car door and sprinted, literally sprinted, into the woods. I sat there for a moment, completely frozen. I couldn't comprehend what had just happened. My mind was spinning. I didn't know what to do. I just sat there in shock until the police and paramedics showed up. I explained everything, even though it sounded crazy, telling them about her eyes, the weird language, and how she ran into the woods. They seemed to take it seriously enough and promised they would try their best to find her. But after that night, she was gone. I never saw Kaylee again. I went back to church the next Sunday, hoping she would show up, but she didn't. Her Instagram was gone, deleted without a trace. I tried texting her, but my messages were blocked. I even had a friend text her number to see if it was still active, and it had been erased. There was no trace of her anywhere. I asked people at the church if they knew her, but no one did. It was like she had never existed. I don't know what happened to her. I still don't. It's been years, and I've never been able to shake that night or the feeling that something isn't right about what happened. I moved away from Maine a few months after it all went down, and my memories of that time feel distorted now. There's something off about that whole period of my life, something that still haunts me. I don't know if I'll ever know what happened to Kaylee, or if I'll ever be able to make sense of that night. But one thing is for sure, the truth is out there, and it's more terrifying than anything I ever could have imagined. I've spent years trying to make sense of that night, but no matter how hard I try, I can't shake the feeling that there's something I'm not seeing. I've had the same questions rattling around in my mind over and over again. Who was Kaylee really? What happened to her? And, more disturbingly, what exactly did I witness? The strange part of it all is how her disappearance was so clean. No one in the church knew who she was. No one remembered her being part of the community. It was like she had never existed at all. I even did some digging, more than I probably should have. I went back to the places we visited that night, hoping to find some clue, some scrap of evidence that could explain what happened. But every time I went back to the woods, or the area where I had last seen her, it felt wrong. Like the land itself had erased her presence, as though she'd never even been there. A few months ago, I was back in Maine for work, and I drove by the church again. I told myself it was just nostalgia, or maybe an attempt at closure. But when I pulled into the parking lot, I saw something that froze me in my tracks. It was a woman, dark hair, slender frame, walking toward the church, head bent low, as if in deep thought. She was wearing a simple black dress, and the way she moved, it reminded me of Kaylee. I hesitated for a moment, then pulled over. My heart raced, and I had this sudden, overwhelming urge to talk to her, to see if she was the same person. I parked my car quickly and stepped out, trying not to look too eager or desperate, though I couldn't stop my eyes from scanning the parking lot for any sign of her. But by the time I made my way over to where she was walking, she was gone. Just like that. Vanished. I checked around the church, walked around the building, nothing. I even asked a few people who were there if they had seen her, but no one had. The church was empty except for a few older congregants preparing for service. I don't know what to think anymore. It's as though something or someone is erasing her from existence. And it's only adding to the weirdness, the growing sense that I'm missing something huge. In an attempt to understand what had happened, I've done more research. I've found references to strange disappearances, people who appear out of nowhere and vanish without a trace. Some of the accounts talk about individuals who are somehow involved with something paranormal, supernatural, even. There are stories about spirits or beings who take on human forms to interact with the living, sometimes to guide them, sometimes to lead them down darker paths. And then there are the more disturbing stories about people who vanish into thin air, only to be forgotten by everyone except the ones they left behind. I don't want to believe any of it. I don't want to believe that Kaylee was something else entirely, that she wasn't just a girl I met at church, that she wasn't real in the way I thought she was. But how else can I explain everything that happened? There's still a part of me that wants to let it go. To forget about her, about that night, and just move on with my life. But the more time passes, the more I feel like I'm being drawn back into it. It's like I'm stuck in this strange loop, constantly thinking about her, searching for answers. And I know, deep down, that it's not over. Whatever happened that night, it's not finished yet. I'm not the only one affected by it, either. A couple of months ago, I ran into someone I used to know, an old friend from the area who had heard about Kaylee. She seemed to know more than she was letting on. After some prodding, she admitted that there had been other people who had been in the area, people who had disappeared, whose presence was erased by the same eerie phenomenon that happened with Kaylee. Apparently, there was some sort of pattern. Some of them vanished completely, while others returned, changed, different, as if they had been altered somehow. And these were people who had interacted with Kaylee, or had been in places similar to where I was that night. It was all too much to make sense of, but it was enough to tell me that I wasn't just imagining things. That something was going on, something bigger than I could understand. I've been trying to track down these people, if they even still exist, and learn what happened to them. I need answers. I need to know why Kaylee ran into the woods that night, why she disappeared, why she was so different. And yet, I can't help but feel like there's a part of this story that I'm not supposed to know. Like I'm being kept in the dark on purpose. The more I dig, the more I realize I'm in over my head. I've started to have dreams again, strange, vivid dreams of a dark forest and figures moving through it. I can't make sense of them, but I know they're connected to her. I can't explain it, but I feel like she's calling to me from somewhere far away. Every time I try to walk away from it all, I'm drawn back in. The memories, the haunting sense of unfinished business, it's like a magnetic force that won't let me go. I don't know what's waiting for me at the end of this. Maybe I'll never find out. But there's a feeling inside of me, a persistent whisper that tells me Kaylee's story isn't over. And neither is mine. The deeper I dug into the mystery of Kaylee, the further I felt I was slipping into something far darker than I could have ever anticipated. The research I had done, the strange people who seemed to know more than they let on, and the dreams, they all led me to believe something was pulling me closer to the truth, something I had been too afraid to face. Weeks had passed since I saw the woman walking toward the church, but the feeling that Kaylee's disappearance was tied to something ancient and hidden refused to fade. If anything, it only intensified. The dreams were getting more vivid, more real, and the line between what was dream and what was reality was starting to blur. In one particularly disturbing dream, I saw Kaylee again. She was standing at the edge of a dark forest, her eyes wild and unfocused, as though she had just woken up from a trance. Then, in the dream, she spoke, only this time, her voice was different. It was colder, distant. "You shouldn't have come back, Ben." The words echoed in my mind, and I woke up with a start, heart racing, breath shallow. The fear I had pushed away for so long now flooded back into me, and I knew it was time to confront whatever this was. I couldn't live in uncertainty anymore. I had to find the answers, even if they meant facing something that might destroy me. I decided to go back. I had to return to the place where it all started, the church, the road where Kaylee disappeared into the woods. There was something there I still hadn't seen, something I was meant to uncover, and I couldn't shake the feeling that Kaylee had left a part of herself behind. That night, after months of avoiding it, I drove back to Maine. The familiar streets of the town greeted me with an unsettling calm. Everything looked just as I remembered it, quiet, peaceful, as if nothing had changed. The air was thick with the same oppressive sense of unease I had felt when I first met Kaylee. I drove past the church, parked across the street, and just sat there for a long while, staring at the building. It almost felt like something was watching me from inside, waiting for me to make my move. I knew I couldn't just walk in. That wasn't the answer. Instead, I drove to the woods where Kaylee had run, the place I hadn't dared to go before. The same feeling of being watched gripped me as soon as I parked the car. The woods seemed to stretch endlessly, dark and silent, as though they were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. I stepped out of the car, my legs heavy with hesitation, but I kept moving forward. The air was cold, the trees towering above me like silent sentinels, and I felt like I was being pulled deeper into the woods with every step I took. I couldn't explain it, but it was as though the path was guiding me, as though Kaylee herself was leading me to something. After what felt like hours, I reached a clearing deep within the forest. The trees were thicker here, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the sky, casting everything in a strange twilight. In the center of the clearing was a stone circle, old, weathered, and covered in moss. I knew, without a doubt, that this was where it had happened. This was the place where Kaylee had run into the woods. The place where she had disappeared. And then I saw her. Kaylee stood in the center of the stone circle, her face pale, her eyes empty. She was still wearing the same dress from the night I met her, the one that seemed to match the forest's eerie atmosphere. She didn't speak, didn't move, but I could feel her presence, as if the very air around me had thickened. I stepped forward, heart pounding in my chest. "Kaylee," I whispered, my voice trembling. "What is this? What happened to you?" She blinked slowly, and for a moment, her eyes seemed to clear. "You shouldn't have come here, Ben." The words were softer now, but still cold. And that's when I realized the Kaylee I had known, the one I had fallen for, wasn't the same anymore. This wasn't her. She stepped back, her body moving with unnatural grace, and the ground beneath my feet seemed to shift. The stone circle began to glow faintly, and the air grew colder. A low, humming sound filled the clearing, and the trees around me started to groan as if they were alive, twisting and stretching toward me. I tried to move, to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. It was like I was rooted to the spot, unable to escape. My breath came in shallow gasps, and I realized with a horrible certainty that I wasn't just facing Kaylee anymore. I was facing whatever had taken her. Whatever had made her vanish, and whatever had pulled me here. "This is where you belong now," Kaylee said, her voice distant and hollow. "You can never leave." I felt a presence behind me, a dark, oppressive force that seemed to grow stronger with every passing second. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it, and it was coming closer. A shadowy figure emerged from the trees, tall, with a presence that made the air itself feel heavy. It was like nothing I had ever seen before, something that didn't belong in the world of the living. "Ben," it whispered, its voice like the rustling of dead leaves. "You were never meant to leave. You were brought here for a reason." Before I could even react, Kaylee's body twisted in a way that human bodies shouldn't, and she started to laugh, only it wasn't her laugh. It was something darker, something ancient. And then, just as quickly as it had all started, everything stopped. The figure in the trees vanished. The stone circle faded into the earth, and the woods returned to their silence. Kaylee was gone. I stood there, trembling, drenched in sweat, my heart still racing in my chest. I was no longer sure of what was real and what wasn't. Was I awake? Had any of this really happened? The shadows of the forest had swallowed her whole, and there was nothing left but the eerie silence that surrounded me. I ran. I ran until I couldn't hear the hum anymore, until I couldn't feel the presence lurking behind me. I ran all the way back to my car, and I didn't look back. But the thing is, I don't think it's over. Every night, I see Kaylee in my dreams. And the shadows follow me wherever I go. I don't know if I'll ever be free of this. But one thing is certain, whatever was in that forest, whatever was connected to Kaylee, it's still out there. Waiting. Thank you for listening to today's story. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Horror Echo. Let us know if you've ever had a similar experience. We'd love to hear your story. Sweet dreams, if you can sleep.